Please, just one night in the barn. That's all I'm asking." Sarah Whitaker said the words before the tall foreman on the porch could reach for his coat. She said them plainly, without softening them, because she had already learned in 3 towns that softness only made rejection easier for the other person. Behind her, 12-year-old Emma held her little brother Lucas by the shoulders. 7-year-old Michael stood between his mother's boots, his cheeks red from the last mile of walking, one hand clutching the hem of her worn gray dress. The wind that came down from the Sawatch Range that afternoon in November of 1889 was not yet the wind of winter. It was the messenger that came a week ahead of it. Every rancher in the Colorado high country knew that messenger, and every rancher moved a little faster the moment it arrived. At the top of the porch steps stood Thomas Reeder, 41 years old, foreman of the Barquet Ranch for 11 of those years. He had not asked for the visitors. He had not asked for the wagon that dropped them at the last fork of the county road and turned around without waiting for a thank you. He had not asked for the sight of 3 children so thin that their coats hung on them the way coats hang on fence posts. He looked at the woman first, then at the children, then at the empty road behind them, and he understood without asking that the road behind them was the last road they had. The Barquet sat 42 miles from the nearest town, tucked into a shallow bowl where 2 ridges met above the north fork of the Gunnison. From the porch a person could see nearly 7 miles of open pasture, the crooked line of the Cottonwood Creek, the low silhouette of the calving barn, the round stone base of the well, and beyond all of it, the mountains. The mountains were already white above the timberline. The mountains were always the first to tell the truth about winter. Thomas had lived long enough to read them the way another man might read a newspaper, and what they were saying that afternoon was not gentle. He turned his head toward the open door of the ranch house. "Robert." From inside came the slow, uneven sound of a cane against a plank floor. Robert Ainsley, 68 years old and the man whose name was on the deed of the Barquet, stepped into the doorway. His left knee had troubled him since a bay mare had rolled on it during a spring roundup a decade earlier, and the cold weather always found it first. He looked at the woman on the steps and the 3 children beside her, and his face did not change, because Robert Ainsley had learned long ago that the face a rancher shows to strangers is the same face he shows to a coming storm. "Where'd she come from?" "Buena Vista, I think. Before that, Salida. Before that, I don't know." Thomas did not turn his head. 3 towns turned her away from the look of it. Robert leaned against the frame. He studied the woman for a long moment. She stood with her shoulders squared and her chin level, the way a person stands when she has stopped expecting kindness but has not yet allowed herself to expect cruelty. That, more than the children, was what held his attention. "Ma'am," he said, "what's your name?" "Sarah Whitaker. My husband was Daniel Whitaker of Laramie County, Wyoming." Robert let the name settle in the cold air of the porch before he answered. Laramie County was a hard country, and the men who worked it did not often carry names lightly. He had known a Whitaker once who ran cattle along the Chugwater, a quiet man, careful with his stock, careful with his word. Whether that had been Daniel or a cousin or an uncle, Robert could not say for certain, but the name alone bought Sarah another half-minute of standing in the wind instead of walking back down the road. "And where is your husband now, Mrs. Whitaker?" "Buried, sir." "Last April. A bull caught him in the shoulder during branding and the wound turned. He lasted 9 days." She spoke the way a person reads a page aloud, not because she did not feel it, but because she had told it enough times to know that adding tears did not change the answer she received at the end. Thomas shifted his weight. He had already made a decision, but he was waiting for the right moment to say it, because on a ranch the wrong moment turned even a fair decision into an argument. Behind Sarah, little Michael tugged at her skirt and whispered something none of the men could hear. She bent and answered him without looking away from the porch. Emma pulled Lucas closer to her side. The girl had the same square-shouldered posture as her mother, and she was watching the 2 men with the careful eyes of someone who had already learned to read faces before words. "Barn's dry," Thomas said finally. "There's a loft above the tack room, clean straw up there and a stove pipe that shares heat with the harness room below. It'll be warmer than the ground floor by a good measure." He paused. "One night, Mrs. Whitaker. That's what I can give you. Come first light, you and the children take the north road. There's a stage stop at Powderhorn, 22 miles. If you leave by dawn, you'll reach it before the second night." Sarah did not thank him. She had learned that thanks given too quickly sometimes made a man take back his offer, as though the gratitude reminded him he had been generous. Instead, she inclined her head once and lifted the small canvas satchel she had been carrying at her side all afternoon. It was not heavy. It contained everything her family still owned in the world, and it weighed less than a full pail of milk. "We're grateful for the shelter," she said. "The children haven't slept indoors for 4 nights." Robert's eyes flicked to the satchel. He noticed the way she held it, close to her ribs, the strap wrapped twice around her wrist, the way a woman holds a thing she cannot afford to lose. He noticed, too, that she had not asked for food, had not asked for water, had not asked for a fire. She had asked only for a roof and only for one night. "Thomas will take you across," Robert said. "Barn's the long one with the red door. Woodstove's already lit for the calving pens." He hesitated, then added, "Boy in the middle looks half frozen. Take the west path, it cuts the wind." Thomas stepped down from the porch and pulled his coat tighter. He did not offer his hand to Sarah. He did not offer to carry the satchel. But he did slow his pace once he was in the yard, so that Michael's short legs could keep up without running. The wind changed direction before they had crossed half the yard. Thomas felt it first at the back of his neck, the way an old horse feels a shift in barometric pressure long before the rider does. He glanced up at the western ridge without slowing his stride. The clouds there had gone the color of wet slate, and they were moving faster than they had been an hour ago. He said nothing to Sarah, because saying nothing was what men on the frontier did when a storm was still a matter of hours away, and there was still work that could be finished before it arrived. The barn was longer than the ranch house and broader through the shoulders. It had been built the year the Barquet was founded, by men who understood that on a Colorado high country range the barn kept the ranch alive, and the house was only where the ranchers slept. The doors were double thick, hung on iron hinges Robert had forged himself in the summer of '79. The red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, but the wood beneath it was sound. Thomas pulled one side open, and the warm animal smell of the calving pens rolled out into the cold, hay and hide and manure, and the low steady breath of livestock that had been sheltered properly. Emma stopped in the doorway. She had not seen a barn like this since her father died. Her small hand tightened around Lucas's, and for the first time since they had left Salida, she did not look at her mother to check whether it was safe. She looked at the barn itself. She looked at the way the lanterns hung on brass hooks with their wicks trimmed evenly, at the way the harnesses were oiled and coiled and hung on pegs in the order they were used, at the way the feed sacks were stacked on wooden pallets instead of on the dirt floor. Emma was 12 years old, and she had grown up on a working ranch. She knew what she was looking at. She was looking at a place run by men who cared. Thomas pointed toward the ladder at the back of the tack room. "Loft's up there, straws fresh, we baled last week. Stove pipe runs through the corner, don't touch it after dark unless you want to burn. There's a horse blanket on the peg by the ladder, take it. Take the wool one under it too." "Thank you," Sarah said. This time she allowed the words. They were quieter than the first time she had spoken. Thomas nodded once, the smallest possible motion of his head. Then he turned to leave. He had crossed 3 strides toward the door before he stopped, because something in the way the children were standing had caught in his chest. Michael had already sat down on the packed dirt floor and was rubbing his hands together in a slow, dazed way. Lucas was staring at the calving pen where a black cow lay chewing her cud with the calm indifference of an animal who has known warmth all her life. Emma had not moved from the doorway. She was still holding her brother's hand. Thomas walked back to the workbench by the tack room. He opened a tin box and took out 3 strips of dried beef. He walked to Emma and held them out. "Chew slow," he said. "You'll make yourselves sick otherwise." Emma took the strips without speaking. She gave one to Lucas and one to Michael before she took the smallest one for herself. Thomas walked back to the ranch house through a wind that had grown teeth in the 15 minutes since he had left the porch. He stamped the snow from his boots on the stone step, because the first flakes had begun to fall while he was inside the barn, and he had not noticed them until they landed on his shoulders. Inside the kitchen, Robert was standing at the window with a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He had not sat down. He was watching the sky. "It's come early," Robert said. "I know." "How early?" Thomas did not answer for a long moment. He hung his coat on the hook by the door and rubbed his hands together over the black iron stove. 2 days, maybe 3, that ridge cloud's already dropping. The mare in the south pasture was pawing at nothing when I passed her. That's what she does before a hard one. Robert set his cup down on the sill. "Bring them in." Thomas turned his head. "Robert, bring them in, Thomas. That barn'll hold against wind, but if this storm sits on us for 3 days, the loft is going to be a cold place for a boy who's already half starved. Bring the woman and the children into the house. She can have the back room. The children can bed down by the stove. And in the morning depends on what the sky does. If it clears, they leave. If it doesn't, they don't. That's the rule of the range, and you know it as well as I do." Robert reached for his cane. "I'll go with you. My knee's stiff, but it still walks. She'll take it easier if I'm the one asking." They crossed the yard together in a wind that had already begun to press the grass flat against the earth. By the time they reached the barn door, the first real snow was falling. Not the small, dry flakes of an ordinary evening, but the wide, wet flakes of a storm that meant to stay. Thomas pulled the door open, and Robert stepped through first, because he had understood correctly that the woman would refuse the offer more easily from a foreman than from the man who owned the deed. Sarah was already at the top of the ladder, spreading the wool blanket across the straw with the practiced motion of a woman who had made a bed out of unlikely places more than once. She looked down when she heard them come in, and her hand paused on the blanket. "Mrs. Whittaker," Robert said, "come down, please. Bring the children." For a moment Sarah did not move. Robert saw the calculation pass through her eyes, the weighing of what a change of mind might mean, whether she was about to be sent back into the storm instead of sheltered from it. He raised one hand in a small, careful gesture, palm open. "The storm is on us sooner than we thought. The house has room. My knee tells me it's going to be a bad one. Please." Sarah came down the ladder. She lifted Michael down first, then reached for Lucas, then let Emma climb down on her own. She gathered the satchel and the 2 blankets and looked at Robert with the same level chin she had shown on the porch an hour before. "We don't take charity, Mr. Ainsley." "It isn't charity," Robert said. "It's neighbors. There's a difference, and you already know it." Sarah followed him out of the barn. By the time they reached the porch, the snow was falling fast enough that Thomas had to squint to see the barn door behind them. Robert opened the kitchen and stepped aside so that Sarah and the children could enter first, and the warmth of the room struck them like a wall. Michael made a small sound that was not a word, and Lucas began to shiver in a way he had not shivered outside, the shivering that starts only when a body finally understands it is safe enough to feel the cold. Emma did not shiver. She stood very straight in the doorway and looked at every corner of the room the way a soldier looks at a new post. "Back room's through that door," Robert said. "It's not been used since my sister came out from Denver 2 summers ago, but the bed is dry and the quilt is clean. Children can lay pallets by the stove. There's ticking in the trunk under the window. Thomas will bring it down." Sarah did not answer immediately. She was looking at the ranch house the way she had looked at the barn, reading it. The kettle on the stove was blackened evenly on the bottom, which meant it had been tended by someone who knew how to keep a fire steady. The floor by the door was worn in a curve where boots had been pulled off for years in the same spot. The window above the sink had been shimmed at the sash with a strip of leather, and the leather was old but the shim was tight. Whoever kept this house kept it the way her father had kept his, and the recognition of it steadied her more than the heat did. "I can pay," she said quietly. "Not in coin, but I can cook, I can mend. I can work the barn as well as any hand. Whatever you keep us, I'll return." "We'll see about tomorrow when tomorrow comes," Robert said. He lowered himself carefully into the chair by the stove and set his cane against the wall. "Tonight you eat, and the children sleep, and nothing else is decided. Thomas had gone back out to the porch to bring in a fresh armload of split cottonwood from the wood box. When he returned, he found Sarah already at the stove. She had not asked permission. She had lifted the lid of the kettle, seen the thin coffee that had been sitting on the plate for the better part of an hour, and moved it to the cooler back corner without comment. Then she had opened the flour crock, checked the level with 2 fingers, taken down the lard tin from the shelf above the sink, and begun measuring biscuits by hand into a shallow tin pan she had found on the peg. She did not measure with cups. She measured with her palm, the way women who have cooked in cabins without instruments learn to measure. Thomas watched her for a moment and then set the wood down without saying anything about it. Emma had knelt by Lucas and was working his boots off gently, because his toes were white at the tips, and she knew. She was 12, and she had grown up in Wyoming, and she knew that the boots had to come off slowly or the pain when the feeling returned would make him cry. She rubbed his feet between her small hands until the color began to return. Robert watched all of it without speaking. Then he looked at Thomas, and Thomas met his eyes. Neither man said anything. They did not have to. The blizzard settled over the Barquet sometime before midnight, and it settled the way a heavy animal settles onto a stall floor all at once, and with no intention of getting up soon. Thomas was the last to sleep. He stood at the kitchen window for nearly an hour after the children had been laid out on pallets by the stove, watching the snow rise against the porch rail one measured inch after another. He had lived through 11 Colorado winters at the Barquet. He knew the shape of a storm that would blow itself out before dawn, and he knew the shape of one that would not. This one would not. The wind was already carrying the low, steady note that meant the mountain passes were closing behind it, and once the passes closed, no help would reach the ranch from any direction until the sky decided to open again. He went asleep in the chair by the stove because his own room faced the north wall, and he wanted to be close to the door if a fence gave or a barn latch tore loose. He did not sleep well. Somewhere near 4 in the morning, he woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen and found Sarah already at the stove, feeding it small, careful pieces of wood, keeping the fire alive at the exact heat needed to hold the room without wasting a single stick. She had not lit the lantern. She was working by the glow through the stove door. "You should sleep," Thomas said quietly. "I did. 4 hours is enough. My husband used to keep this watch." She did not turn her head. The wind shifted at 3. It's coming out of the northwest now instead of straight north. That's harder on the calving barn. Thomas sat up straighter in the chair. He had not noticed the shift himself, and it embarrassed him a little that she had. "How do you know?" "I heard the loose board on your porch. It rattles differently when the wind swings." Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then he stood, pulled on his coat, and went out into the snow to check the calving pens. He came back inside 20 minutes later with ice in his beard and told Robert, who had risen at the sound of the door, that the 2 heifers due to drop first had been moved into the inner pen against the south wall, and that the water trough in the main barn had a skin of ice thicker than a man's thumb. The wind was blowing so hard at the north door of the calving barn that he had needed to lean his shoulder against it to close it behind him. Robert nodded once and reached for his coat, and that was when his cane slid on the wet plank where snow had blown in under the kitchen door. His left leg went out from under him faster than either Thomas or Sarah could reach him. He fell hard against the corner of the wood box, and Thomas heard the sound the hip made, a sound that was not loud but was distinct in the way that no other sound in a working man's life is distinct, and Thomas knew before he had crossed the room what it meant. Robert did not cry out. He lay very still on the floor with his eyes closed and his mouth pressed into a thin line, breathing through his nose the way a man breathes when he is trying not to move any muscle he does not have to move. Sarah was already on her knees beside him. "Don't move him," Sarah said. Her voice was low, but it carried the flat authority of a person who had said the same words before, over a body she had loved, in a cabin far from any doctor. "Thomas, get me the straightest board you can find from the woodpile. Not a split piece, a whole one, thumb thick and about as long as his leg. 2 of them if you can. Then the harness room. There's a coil of soft cotton lead there, bring it, and a horse blanket, the wool one folded twice. Thomas did not argue. He went. Emma had woken at the sound of the fall and had risen from her pallet without a word, and she came to her mother's side and knelt there without being told. Lucas and Michael slept on. Sarah did not send Emma away. She had learned when Emma was 5 years old that some children could see hard things without breaking, and Emma was one of them. "Mr. Ainsley," Sarah said quietly, leaning close to his ear, "I need to feel the leg. I'm going to be as careful as I can, but it will hurt." "Can you tell me when it hurts most?" Robert opened his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment through the pain, and then he nodded once, a very small motion. Sarah slid her hand along the outside of his thigh and down toward the hip, pressing gently through the wool of his trousers with the flat of her fingers. She had not needed to be a doctor to know what she was looking for. Her husband Daniel had ridden with a Wyoming range outfit for 6 years before their marriage, and he had set 2 hips and a shoulder in cow camps where no doctor could be fetched, and he had taught her every step of it in their kitchen during the long winter evenings, because he had said, and she remembered his words exactly, that a rancher's wife is the first doctor a ranch has and often the only one. She found the joint. She felt the wrongness of it. The head of the femur had not driven out through the socket. It had cracked at the neck, which was a mercy for a man of 68, because a clean break at the neck could be immobilized and would knit if he was kept still and warm long enough, whereas a dislocation at his age would have been much worse. "It's the neck of the bone," she said. "Not the joint. That's good news. We can splint it and hold you steady, but you cannot move that leg for 6 weeks. Not to walk, not to stand. Not even to shift in bed without help. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Robert said. His voice was thin, but it was steady. Thomas came back with 2 hickory boards from the drying rack behind the stove, clean cured wood, the kind Robert kept for repairing wagon tongues, and the coil of soft cotton lead from the harness room, and the wool blanket folded twice. Sarah took the shorter board and laid it against the outside of Robert's leg from hip to knee, and the longer board against the inside from groin to ankle. She padded both boards with folded strips torn from the blanket, and she bound them with the cotton lead in a figure 8 around the hip, and a series of firm loops down the length, tight enough to hold but never tight enough to cut circulation. She worked without speaking except to warn him before each pressure. When she had finished, Sarah sat back on her heels and looked at Thomas. "We need to get him onto the bed in the back room, not lifted, slid on the blanket. Emma, take the corner by his shoulder. Thomas, the corner by his hip on the good side. I'll take the leg. On 3, we lift the blanket, not him. He must not bend at the waist." They moved him inch by inch across the kitchen floor. Robert made no sound. Sarah spoke to him the whole way in the same low, even voice, telling him what would come next before it came, and Thomas understood as he watched her that this was another thing her husband had taught her, that a man in pain who knows what is about to happen bears it better than a man who does not. They laid him in the bed, and Sarah propped the injured hip with a rolled blanket to keep the joint from settling wrong. Then she stood, and for the first time since the fall she allowed herself to draw a full breath. Outside, the wind had risen another degree. The window in the back room shuddered against its shim. "Thomas," she said, "how many head in the calving barn?" 14, 2 due within the week. "And the main herd, how many are you wintering?" 63. "They're bunched in the north pasture behind the windbreak Robert built in 84. Water. Stock tank at the base of the well line. It's fed by a pipe from the spring head above the pasture." Sarah nodded slowly, and Thomas watched her turn something over in her mind the way a smith turns iron in a fire, judging the color of it. Then she said the thing he had already begun to suspect she would say. "That pipe will crack before the 2nd day. The spring line runs shallow. I saw the trench when we came up the road. It's not dug deep enough for this kind of freeze. When it goes, the tank goes with it, and the herd will be 63 head with no water at 40 below. It's held every winter for 11 years. It's never held a storm like this one. My father lost 40 head in 81 on a spring line dug the same way. I know what it looks like before it cracks. I know what it sounds like. If you send me out with a lantern in the next hour, I can tell you whether it's already started." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his coat. They went out together. The wind on the yard was a solid thing now, a wall a person had to lean against to walk into. Sarah carried the lantern low, close to the snow, and Thomas walked behind her because she had told him plainly that she knew the shape of a failing spring line better than he did, and that he was to look where she pointed and not where he thought. He did not argue. Somewhere in the last hour he had stopped thinking of her as the woman on the porch and started thinking of her as a hand. It had happened without his notice, the way weather changes without a person's notice. At the base of the well she knelt in the snow and pressed her ear against the frozen ground beside the pipe. She held up one hand for silence. She listened for a long 30 seconds. Then she looked up at Thomas. "It's already cracking," she said. "We have maybe 6 hours." They worked through the rest of the night and into the gray dawn that was not really a dawn, because the storm had thickened until the sky above the ranch showed no difference between 4 in the morning and 8. Sarah drew the plan in the snow with the tip of the lantern handle. She would not try to save the buried pipe. There was no time and no ground soft enough to dig. Instead, she would run a temporary line from the spring head down the slope in a shallow trench cut through the drifts themselves, insulated with straw and canvas, and packed over with more snow, because snow that has been packed to the density of a wall is one of the warmest materials the frontier knew, and every homesteader's child in Wyoming had grown up sleeping under a roof reinforced by the same principle. Thomas listened. Then he went to fetch the canvas from the wagon shed and the length of copper pipe Robert had bought 2 summers earlier for a project he had never begun. By the time the sun was somewhere behind the clouds, they had a working line. The tank filled. The herd came down out of the wind to drink one after another, and Thomas counted 63 head and let out a breath he had not known he was holding. Emma had come out to help pack snow along the trench, her small mittened hands working steadily beside her mother's. Michael and Lucas stayed by Robert in the back room. Michael read to him from the only book the family owned, which was a torn copy of the Book of Ruth that Daniel had carried in his saddle bag. Robert listened with his eyes closed, and the corner of his mouth lifted at the parts where the boy stumbled over the harder words. By the second day, the wind had begun to freeze the cattle themselves. Sarah walked the north fence with Thomas and showed him where the drift was going to break through the old windbreak by nightfall. She had already thought the problem through. There were 2 wagons in the shed. Their canvas covers were sound. If they cut the canvases loose and stretched them between the freight posts along the north edge of the pasture, the herd would have a second wall to stand behind, and the drift would build against the canvas instead of against the animals. Thomas cut the canvases. Sarah rigged the ropes. Emma held the lantern. By the time full dark came again, the herd was standing quietly in the lee of a windbreak that had not existed 12 hours before, and the drift had begun to climb the canvas exactly the way Sarah had said it would. On the 3rd day, the ice on the stock tank grew thick enough that the cattle could not break it themselves. Sarah took the pole axe from the tack room and went out alone before Thomas woke, because she had said the night before that she would take the dawn round, and he had not argued. She cut through the ice at 4 separate points along the tank, then hauled 2 buckets of hot water from the kitchen kettle out to the pipe head to keep the flow from freezing at its source. She came back into the kitchen with icicles in her hair and did not sit down. She put more wood on the stove and went to check on Robert. He was awake. He watched her cross the room to feel his forehead and his pulse and to check the splint. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said quietly, "what was your husband's full name?" "Daniel Elias Whittaker, of Whittaker Draw on the Chugwater." Robert closed his eyes. He remembered him now. On the 4th morning the wind stopped. Not gradually, all at once, the way a held breath is let go. Sarah heard the silence before she heard anything else, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up over the eastern ridge for the first time in 3 days. The pasture was white and unbroken all the way to the timber line. 63 head of cattle stood in the lee of a canvas windbreak that had held. The stock tank ran clear. In the back room, Robert Ainsley slept with a splint that had begun to feel less like a punishment and more like a promise. The rider came before noon. He came up the county road on a heavy bay gelding, and he wore a coat too fine for the country he was riding through, and Thomas knew him before he reached the yard. His name was Cyrus Halloran. He owned the Rocking H, 12 miles to the south, and he had been waiting for 8 years for the Barquet to slip far enough into debt that he could take it at a foreclosure sale. Robert had held on. Robert had always held on. But the note that Cyrus was riding to collect that morning was a note with a specific date on it, and the date was the 15th of November, and Robert had been laid up in bed with a broken hip for 4 of the days the note was due. Cyrus rode into the yard with 2 men behind him and a folded paper in his coat pocket, and he said what he had ridden 12 miles to say. The Barquet was his. Robert had 30 days to vacate. The cattle would be counted at his direction, and the deed would be transferred at the county seat in Gunnison on the 1st of December. Thomas said nothing. Robert, propped in the back-room bed with the door open so he could hear the yard, said nothing either. Sarah walked out onto the porch in her worn gray dress with the satchel over her shoulder. "Mr. Halloran," she said, "my name is Sarah Whitaker. My husband was Daniel Elias Whitaker of the Chugwater. In the spring of '84, he co-signed on the northern half of the parcel that is now the Barquet, as security for a loan Mr. Ainsley took to expand the calving barn. The loan was repaid in full by '86. My husband's name was never removed from the deed, because the paperwork was never carried down from Cheyenne to be corrected. Under Colorado frontier law, a widow inherits her husband's undivided interest in any parcel he held at his death. I hold that interest now. I hold it in front of these 3 witnesses, and I am not selling." She reached into the satchel. She took out the folded document Daniel had kept in the tin box under their bed for 5 years, and she unfolded it, and she held it out to Cyrus Halloran. Cyrus read it. He read it twice. Then he folded it, handed it back, and turned his horse without a word. That evening Thomas sat on the edge of Robert's bed, and Robert looked at the ceiling for a long time before he spoke. "Offer her the partnership," he said. "Half of everything, in writing, tomorrow." Thomas did. Sarah accepted at the kitchen table with Emma standing beside her. Michael and Lucas slept by the stove. The Barquet had a new name coming, and 3 children finally had a door of their own to close before the snow. If this story warmed you, please like, share, comment, and subscribe.